I have a terrier mix.
All right.
But he looks like a schnauzer.
We are live, and so now everyone knows that you have a schnauzer terrier mix. The whole world. It is so good to see you all today. Welcome back. We have a lot to get through today. We are doing Esther chapters 5 through 8. That's what we'll be studying. As a heads up, this is our second to last week of our class on this particular set of books. And so this week we'll be looking at Esther 5, 6, 7, 8. Next week we'll be reading Esther 9 and 10. And then we will be doing a recap kind of question and answer time at the end of next week's session. And so if you have questions, if you have things that have come up that you're really interested in diving a little bit deeper into, especially when we don't have quite as much to get through, that last 30 minutes of class is a really good time to ask your questions. And it's a really good time to sort of dive a little bit deeper into the discussion of it. We just always have so much to get through, so I don't get to spend as much time on questions as I'd like while we're chatting like this. I know we have a couple of absences. We have a slightly smaller group today. Ron and Sandy are down in Tampa. I know that they have some health things that Sandy specifically has to work with. And so I hope she'll be able to join us live. I tried to give her a call today, but I didn't get her. Nan told me she wasn't going to be here. Beth said she was going to be here, but I don't know where she is. So she might just be a little bit late. And that's most of our folks. I don't know where Pat Richards is either, but Pat and Peggy have family in, and so there's always something going on, and we are at the time of year where life is getting a little bit busier, which is why we'll be ending next week, taking a little bit of break. We'll pick back up in January, and I'll have a little bit of information on what we're going to do next in January or at the end of next week so that y'all will know where to look. And if it's a longer book, which it likely will be than Ruth and Esther, most books of the Bible are longer than Ruth and Esther. You'll have a chance to read ahead if you'd like, or maybe get some information, and then we'll jump in mid-January. Last week, we had a lot that we had talked about, and we went through quite a bit. We talked specifically about Esther's movement into the throne. What it meant that she was becoming, in some ways, the queen of this non-Jewish nation. And she is slowly but surely building power. We talked about Haman's plot and how he wanted to have Mordecai killed. We talked about Mordecai being a little sneaky, but also mourning greatly when he hears that Xerxes has put out this great decree to have all the Jewish people killed. And we talked about what it meant for all of these characters to be converging on what will be this great turnaround. Where we ended last week was with Esther agreeing to talk to King Xerxes, which is a big moment. Because you don't go into King Xerxes' throne room. That's for King Xerxes. You can't just walk in to where the king lives. And she says right at the end of chapter 4, and I'll read it to you. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. Those are the stakes that we walk into this week. And so, with that being said, let's take a moment to have a prayer, and we will hop right on in. Pray with me. Holy and loving God, we are grateful for this opportunity to look through your scriptures, to do the work of studying so that we might know you a little bit better. Lord, as we read through this book of Esther, this book in which you feel specifically silent, reveal to us where you are at work. Help us to see your action so that we might see in our own lives your action. We ask that you open our minds, open our hearts, and open our eyes to what you would have us learn tonight so that we might go from this place better suited to call ourselves your followers. We pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right. And so we jump right on in to chapter 5. And there is a major power shift that takes place. Xerxes has been able to call all the shots. And we've talked about Xerxes a lot, right? And I think, Martha, it was you who said Xerxes is a bore. I think that's the word that you use.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Xerxes is not a smart guy. He chases after women. He doesn't really think too hard. And he, admittedly, is pretty easily convinced of the last thing that he heard basically every single time. Anytime somebody goes to Xerxes and says, hey, I want to do this, Xerxes says, that's a great idea, and does it irregardless of any consequences. Xerxes wants to make people happy, and he wants to give people a thumbs up. And so Esther, someone who has now seen Xerxes, who has seen how easy it is to change his mind, hatches a plot. And the major sticking point, the major conflict point is this: you don't walk into the king's chambers unannounced. She hadn't even seen the king. She is the king's wife for 30 days. She even has to be invited. But she goes in anyway. And that's where we pick up. I want to read to you, starting in chapter 5. This is chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. And so we have some scene setting. And I want you to take a moment, close your eyes if you can. Really imagine this. You have on one end of this royal throne room, imagine 100 feet long, decorated to the T's. The king sitting in his chair, holding his scepter. And in comes Esther. She's put on her royal robes. She is dressed for the occasion. But 100 feet away, the only person who is in this room, surrounded by the ornate nature of what is going on in the Babylonian Empire at the time, there's Esther. She is, in some ways, surrounded by the king's power. This is his throne room. And she begins the slow walk, as if I were trying to walk across or all the way down to the end of this sanctuary towards the king, knowing that this could be her walking to her death. If your eyes are closed still, you can open them. The image that is being presented is a scary one. Esther is not doing something that's easy, but this is the first place we have in this particular book where Esther takes direct action, where she makes a decision that is her own. Even when she was talking to the eunuchs and the king's advisors, just do what's recommended. I'll do whatever. At this point, Esther is beginning to take control of her situation. And it works. She walks down this aisle towards the king, and she is welcomed in, which was a surprise. She shouldn't be walking down this aisle. And who knows? This could be because of Xerxes' own nature. Oh, I haven't seen my wife in a while. This is great. For whatever reason, she is not put to the sword immediately. She approaches the king. And so, I'm going to keep reading. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be given to you." Then Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do what Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you." "And what is your request?" "Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "This is my petition and my request. If I have won the king's favor, and it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king said." And so the king is in the midst of granting Esther's request. There is a power play. Now, this is what we've been told is the standard. But Esther's hand rests atop the golden scepter. Now, the king has to extend that scepter. This was what it was set up earlier, that this is customary. You have to go in, and if you are being excused of your transgression of walking in without being invited, the king will extend this scepter to you, and you rest your hand on top of it. But take a moment and think about the power dynamic at play in this scene. The scepter is symbolic. It's not just a rod. It is something that the king has that demonstrates the king's power on behalf of the entirety of the nation. And here, whose hand is upon it, resting on the top?
Yeah.
A Jewish orphan woman who has risen to the rank of the queen. That's a powerful image. The people of God hold their hand above the power of the king.
But didn't you just say that happens? Whoever comes in with the request, is they're going to put their hand?
If they're allowed to stay.
Yeah, so they could, that could be a non-believer or
It could be.
anything.
But remember, as the writer is writing this text, as the writer is doing their best to tell this story, we are told that this is something that can happen, but we are not shown a scene of it happening. We never get a moment in which this happens. We don't have a moment in which Haman is the one who walks in and places his hand above the scepter. Though we'd imagine that may have happened, because Haman goes and makes requests too, yet we never get that scene. The fact that we are being told directly is the author trying to tell us something. The symbolism matters. And these moments in Scripture where we have a particular moment of Esther doing something where we see no one else doing it. We're told it can happen, but we see no one else doing it. It matters. The biblical authors, they knew what they were doing, and the symbolism does matter. Now, yes, anybody else could have done this. It matters that Esther did. Esther is the one who accomplishes this feat, even if it doesn't seem like much, because it can happen. And that's his wife. And would he have really put his wife to the sword? Well, he kicked his last wife out of the kingdom forever, so maybe. That symbolism, it matters. And so, while this is all going on, Haman is throwing his own little party. Because Haman, he is ready to have Mordecai put to the stake. He is ready to ensure that Mordecai is never a bother again. And so, moving on to chapter 9, Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And then he sent and called to his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the ministers of the king. Haman added, even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her, together with the king. Yet all this does me no good so long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, let a pole 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hung on it. Then go with the king to his banquet in good spirits. This advice pleased Haman, and he had the pole made. You remember, if you were here last week, we talked about how Haman had a bit of a pride problem. Haman was pretty full of himself. He calls together all of his friends and his wife. Look at all this cool stuff I did. Look at how many sons I have. Look at all of the riches that I've accumulated. Even the queen wants me to be at this banquet and nobody else, just me. I'm something. But you know what? You know who doesn't see it? That Mordecai guy. I can't stand him. And so he erects the pole, 50 cubits high. This is a tall pole, friends. Cubits are big pieces of measurement. Now, we don't know exactly how long a cubit is. We have a guess. A cubit is, if you remember from your Sunday school classes, elbow to the tip of the ring finger. A little bit longer than a foot. The reason we don't know exactly how long it is because it was the king's elbow to the tip of their ring finger. And I don't know if you've realized this yet, but people come in a lot of different sizes. And so we don't know exactly how high it is, but we're talking a spectacle here. This is a 50-plus foot pole in the middle of town. That's where Haman is going to have Mordecai. That is a big deal. And consider the actual logistics of this. This is the middle of town that this pole is going to be erected, which means a few things have to happen. Somebody has to go out into the forest and cut down a tree, a big tree, right? They have to find a tree that is over 50 feet tall, and then before the morning comes, they have to then drag that log with their servants back into town, or at least process it outside of town so that it can be made into the stake. And then a 50-foot stake would be brought through the kingdom to the center of the kingdom in front of the king's gate. And then they'd have to dig a pretty big hole to ensure that that stake stayed standing up. This was no small feat. Mordecai is going to great lengths to have this done. It reminds me, Haman, I apologize. Names always get me. Haman's going to great lengths to have this type of thing done. It reminds me of Disney World. My grandfather, he was a night security guard for Disney's Animal Kingdom. That's what he did. And he would tell me about what would take place at night at Disney. If you had a piece of pavement that had a crack in it, overnight, like nothing happened, they would have cranes inside of Disney lifting out those pieces of pavement and replacing them, and you'd never know it took place. Massive efforts of construction that would take place overnight so that the magic of Disney wasn't ruined. This is that level. This is that level of movement. All because Haman hates Mordecai. And so Mordecai, he's living on borrowed time. Which brings us to chapter 6. And the very first thing that happens in chapter 6 is another moment where we begin to ask, where is God at work? Because you know who can't sleep? The king. He's tossing and turning. He knows he has a big day tomorrow. The queen's throwing a banquet. My wife invited me to a banquet, and I'm going to have friends there. And that good guy that I know, Haman, he's coming. But you know, I can't stop thinking, who's that guy who told me about that assassination plot? Who's that guy who told me about the two guards who wanted me dead? Did we ever do anything for him? Did we ever honor him in any way? That's what the king's thinking about. Middle of the night. As the pole is being erected in the town square, the king can't sleep because he's thinking about Mordecai. This is another moment, friends, where I invite you to ask yourself, where is God at work? It's that little voice in the king's head. Did we ever do anything for that guy? And so he gets his advisors together and the guards. Excuse me. And he says, hey, why don't we get him to come out? I want to honor him tomorrow. And I love what happens because Haman shows up in the morning. And you know who the king has already called? Mordecai. And so I'm going to start reading from verse 5 of chapter 6. So the king's servants told him, Haman is there, standing in the court. The king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor? Haman said to himself, whom would the king wish to honor more than me? There's the pride. So Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be bought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on his head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to the one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. The king said to Haman, quickly take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Let out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Of all the people in all the kingdom who could be sent to honor Mordecai, it's Haman. The morning that Haman was going to have Mordecai executed. God's name is never mentioned in the book of Esther, and yet we see God's work. And Mordecai, in a lot of ways, is throughout this story representative of the whole of the Jewish people. He is the one who we first see wearing the sackcloth and the ashes during the time of mourning. And here he is, right before Queen Esther reveals her identity to the king, wearing the regal robes that the king has worn, with a crown on his head, riding on a royal war horse. God's people are regaining power over their situation. And Mordecai is kind of a stand-in for all of God's people, because this shift between the power of the world outside of God's people, of the worldly place, to the people of God, is beginning to take place. And it's going to be drastic. And we get that warning from Haman's family and friends. If this Mordecai guy is Jewish, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. It's about to get bad for you. And without spoiling it too much, it does get bad for Haman. He does not survive this story. But we can see God's work if we look at it in hindsight. If we look at it with a close eye, without God ever being mentioned, we can see God at work. Haman, specifically, has a downfall. And that downfall is his pride. It's at the center. Haman never once. And while it's important that there's no mention of God, the God of Israel, there's no mention really of gods generally, which would have been odd. In a lot of other stories in Scripture, we see gods being mentioned. Other nations' gods, other tribes' gods. You have prophets challenging gods, and the God of your people will never beat the God of my people. I mean, in some of them, you could really switch out. I don't know if you remember being on a playground and hearing, well, my dad can beat up your dad kind of arguments. Some of Israel's arguments with other tribes and nations kind of boil down to some of that. But there's no mention of Haman's gods either. Haman wasn't willing to say anybody deserved credit but him. And just picture how this would have gone differently. Just for a second. If Haman didn't get so mad at Mordecai, because he literally sets up the tool that will kill him. The 50-foot tall pole that he had people working overnight to get up into the town square was set up by him. Because he saw Mordecai and made him mad. It's the pride. And I know we like to talk about all kinds of sins in church. We like to talk about all of the things that people should and shouldn't be doing, and all of the ways that people should and shouldn't be acting. But boy, oh boy, isn't pride a tricky one. It really, really is. I'll admit, it's something that I struggle with all the time. I mean, really, it's at the center of it. It is hard to balance my ego with what I feel God wants me to do when I have to stand up in front of over 100 people every Sunday. And it's real easy to look back at our lives and say, well, I know I did all of that myself. And it's real easy to look back at our own lives and say, well, I was pretty good. I deserve it. That's pride. Because all of the gifts that we have come from God. Every single one of them. Our ability to speak, our ability to live, the air in the sky, all of our assets, all of them are God's. We don't get around it. And it's real easy to convince ourselves, well, maybe I did that one myself. Which is what Haman did. When he went to his friends and he went to his wife. He said, look at all the stuff I did. Even the queen wants to hang out with me. It's pride. Pride and humility are, in a lot of ways, at the center of our faith. We have to be humble. Because in order to be able to truly turn to God and say, hey, Jesus, I need some help. I don't have this figured out. You have to have some humility. And it's not always easy to say, I don't have this. And the last note that I'll give you is one of my favorite notes. Came from a pastor of mine. And it's kind of a sidebar, but I think it's important. If you think you're really humble, you probably need to check your humility. The person who says, I'm the most humble person in the room is not humble. That's not how humility works. It's a battle. It's putting and thinking about yourself less. Putting yourself further to the back. Putting God closer to the front. Haman didn't do that. And you can argue in some ways, neither did Mordecai. You can argue neither did Xerxes. In some ways, maybe not even Esther. But Haman's the foil here. We see him outright declare, look at all this cool stuff I did. And immediately, he's met with his downfall. The very next morning. You think you got it all figured out? That guy you hate, you're going to put a robe on him. And that's where our story leads us, into chapters 7 and 8. Are there any questions about those first two chapters before we move forward?
You put a lot of stress on Haman.
Mm-hmm.
And, the element of pride and what have you. But again, the story seems to be also about just the preservation of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that seems to be one of the biggest.
And we get there. There's always something that's worth noting. Whenever we're talking about the preservation of God's people, right? And whenever we're talking about God's work in the world, we have to ask a question. I think it's an important one, that there are some Christians who don't always ask, and there are some times when I don't ask. Because we can make the parallel between, okay, here's the preservation of the Jewish people from the massacre that is going to happen up on the king's request. Something needs to be done. How do we save the Jewish people, right? And we can make that same parallel from that to, okay, we are a people who live in sin. We are waiting in darkness, trying our best to make it, but we can't on our own. And so God sends Jesus. God comes to us as Jesus, and we become the people of God through Jesus' saving, right? Those things are in some ways parallel. And anytime we're asking those questions about salvation, we always have to ask, salvation from what? And salvation to what? Salvation from what? And salvation to what? Those two questions, they matter. And we have to consider at this moment in Israel's history, this is post-Babylonian exile. This is before Israel really has any chance to rebuild, and they really don't. I mean, the Babylonian exile is, in a lot of ways, the end of the historical nation of Israel as we would understand it. They would have a couple more years, couple hundred years to build some things back up, and then Roman occupation takes over, and we are into the story of Jesus. I mean, we're pretty close at this moment. And so what has taken place before? Well, Haman is a villain in a lot of ways. Haman is almost cartoonishly evil in some ways. He's a good foil for the people of Israel, because what did Israel do wrong? What got them in the hot water to begin with? Well, a lot of it was pride. A lot of it was, I don't need God anymore. I can do whatever I want to do. It's the same pride and the same lack of care for the other that all of the prophets warn against before Israel is sent into Babylonian exile. That pride was at the center.
Stubborn.
Oh, they were definitely stubborn, that's for sure. But, so yes, I'm focusing a lot on Haman. And yes, you're right, Ken, to point towards the preservation of the Jewish people. But that preservation in some ways is a salvation. We are saving the Jewish people in this situation, but we are saving them in some ways from themselves. They had put themselves in a situation where they needed to be in this foreign land in the first place. And here's this remnant that's left in this foreign land. Even after all of the exile has ended, they are left. But why were they there in the first place? Because of the pride of the Jewish people. And what are they being saved to? Is faithfulness. Not Haman. That's not what you're supposed to be. And so, yes, preservation is important. But from what and to what are two really good questions. Same thing with us. What are we being saved from? Sinfulness. What are we being saved to? Holiness. Godliness. Being Christ-like. Loving one another. There's another step. I think sometimes we like to forget that second step. We just like to sit in that, boy, oh boy, I got saved. Doesn't it feel good? But there's something we're supposed to do afterwards. Okay, for sake of time, we are going to move forward into chapter 7. And this is verse 1. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it should be fulfilled." That's the third time he said this, by the way. I'll give you half my kingdom if you ask. But think about that promise versus God's promise. Half of my kingdom, salvation. Half of my kingdom, salvation. And while I know that this is kind of looking with my Christian studying hat on, and I am thinking about what is happening here through a lens of what I know about Jesus Christ, I can't help but see the image of God who has sent Jesus Christ to be with us, watching over Jesus. God the Father watching over Jesus in the desert as he's being tempted. You see the kingdoms of the earth, they can all be yours if you want it. Just jump, the angels will save you anyway. Esther, what do you want? Even half my kingdom. Esther could have done anything in this moment. I mean, she hasn't even revealed that she's Jewish yet. She has the ability to ask for anything. And she has to make a choice. It may not seem like a choice because of how quickly the story moves, but she has been presented with a lot of power. And she could grasp at it. And she doesn't. And so, then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition. For the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, said to Queen Esther, "Who is he and where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. It's easy to miss it, but this is Esther telling the king, "My people are about to be destroyed." This is her saying, "Hey, I'm Jewish. I am the one that you are calling to have killed. And we've been sold. You gave Haman all of this gold for reporting the sins of my people. He took a wonderful bounty." Again, a risk. The king has made a decree, a royal decree, that all the Jewish people will be killed in a certain number of days. And here the queen is saying, "I'm one of those people you've sent to be killed." The king has to make a choice too. What's he going to do? Now it helps. I'll note, it helps a lot. It's the second day of a party and the king is a little drunk. I mean, let's be honest. That's what's going on. Esther doesn't ask right at the top of the party. It's the second day. The wine's been flowing. They have had plenty to eat, plenty to drink. The king is satiated. Esther, she knows when to ask. The king has had plenty of wine. And she asks. And who is it? That other guy we invited to the party. That's the one. I wouldn't want to be Haman in that moment. I would not. Because not only was he embarrassed by having to go out and put that coat and that robe and that crown and put his mortal enemy, his self-declared mortal enemy, Mordecai, on the war horse, but now he's sitting in the room with the king when the queen says, that vicious, that wicked Haman. He's the one who tried to sell me out. And if you want to know exactly where that is, that's verse 6, a foe and an enemy. this wicked Haman of chapter 7. And so, Haman begs. All of a sudden, humility seems like a good move. Moving on to verse 7. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king said, "Will he even violate the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very pole that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hung Haman on the pole that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. And so not only is Haman pointed out, but as Haman is begging, the queen is on this massive reclining couch, and he throws himself on the couch to beg for his life, and the king walks back in, and Haman's on his wife's couch. It's a bad time for Haman. But there's now a forced humility, this begging and pleading for his life. This isn't where Haman was just the day before. There's a reversal that's taking place, and it's an important one. We start this story with the Jewish people in the weakest position they can possibly be in. They're a remnant people. Not even all of them are left in this kingdom under King Xerxes. They're in some ways outcasts because they have different traditions and they have different ways of living. There aren't that many of them, so they're easy to villainize, right? And it's easy to say, it's probably their fault. To this moment where the queen, a Jewish woman, sits as Haman, the enemy of the Jewish people, is dragged away to be killed on the very pole that he erected for a Jewish man to be killed on. The reversal is important. And I mention that because this brings us to one of those themes that match between the books of Ruth and Esther, right? At the beginning of the book of Ruth, we have Naomi, who is happily married for a couple of verses until we get a 10-year time jump. And then her husband dies and her kids have died, and all that she's left with are these two daughters-in-law, one of which books it and goes home. There is a desperate moment in the book of Ruth where Naomi even changes her own name to mean sorrow, and pain, and suffering. And in that book, over the course of those 4 chapters, we see this great reversal. And we go from death at the beginning of the story to new life at the end. Death of Naomi's husband, death of Naomi's sons, to Ruth's baby being born and saying, "This child was born unto you, Naomi." Esther deals with the same themes. The Jewish people are undercounted, they're weak, they have no real political power. To Esther, a Jewish woman's hand on the scepter. Esther, the one who lounges in the king's court, who the villain is being taken away from. Major reversals. We see the same kind of reversal with Haman and Mordecai. Haman was just talking about how much gold and how much power and how wonderful he was and how everybody loved Haman. And just a few verses later, he is putting the robe on Mordecai, who was wearing the sackcloth and ashes just a few chapters ago. The reversal was right there. And it's Haman who's begging for his life. Hey, Mom. It's Haman who's begging for his life, not Mordecai. But there's still a problem. the decree has still been sent out. Esther has accumulated the power that she needs. The person who stood in the way of the Jewish people's safety, Haman, has been executed. But there's a ball rolling down a hill. And that ball, it's collecting dust and it's collecting rocks and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger because the royal decree to have all of the Jewish people killed is still out there. And remember, royal decrees, they can't be taken back. And so how do we solve this problem? I'll tell you, it seems like a happy ending for the Jewish people. It's not a very happy ending for the guards who are carrying out the decree. It's a pretty bloody ending, if we're honest with ourselves. But we'll get to that. We move into chapter 8. And so, chapter 8, verse 1. On that day, King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king. Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote, giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see this calamity that is coming on my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hung him on the pole because he plotted to kill the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's secretaries were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews and to the satraps and to the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Cush, 127 provinces, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and language. He wrote letters in the name of King Xerxes, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers, riding on fast steeds bred from the royal herd. By these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, their children, their women, and to plunder their goods, on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the writ was issued as a decree in every province and published to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their royal steeds, hurried out. Urged by the king's command, the decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. And so, we have a second decree. And if we want to talk about power, who writes it? Mordecai. It's not even the king. The Jewish people have gained power. They don't have the title of king, but at this point, who's really calling the shots? It's Esther and Mordecai. They're on top. They can do whatever they want. Mordecai's even given the king's signet ring. It would have been like a stamp on the wax of the letter to say this is really from the king. Mordecai could have written more decrees if he wanted, but he writes the one. We will get to, in the next chapter, the destruction of the enemies of the Jews, which is the helpful subtitle that my particular translation of the Bible gives us. But the Jews are given free rein. Defend yourselves. Do what it takes to survive. There's a shift. I mean, think about it. These are the occupying armies, the ruling armies of these lands are going to come in, and they are going to try to wipe out all of the Jews. These are government officials, and these are people who are in charge of militaries themselves, generals. Defend yourselves. There's no consequence for defending yourself. For killing the armies of the king. Couldn't take back the old edict. The old edict was out there. But the Jewish people are given a shot. We'll talk more about it next week. But again, when we ask the question, where is God at work? The fact that they survive is quite a miracle.
Did you have any paperwork for this week?
Oh, I didn't give it out.
No.
It's somewhere. I'll get it to you in a second. Sorry. Yes, I did. And so our story continues. The great reversal has taken place. Haman, who was on top, who was in power, who had the ear of the king, who was able to get the king to write decree and edict, having all the Jewish people killed, is now dead. The person who is now writing decrees and edicts, the person who has the ear of the king to again get the king to do whatever he wants, because the king does whatever the last person who asks him to do something does. It's Mordecai. It's Esther.
And our Bible here,
Sure.
the very last sentence in chapter 8 says, and many people through all the empire became Jews because they were afraid of the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot that changes.
Yeah.
People are looking to save themselves. I'll join in with the more powerful folks. And at that moment, it was the Jewish people. Now, again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the end of this conflict is the Jewish people succeed, right? They are the ones who succeed, and they're the ones who are able to protect themselves in a way that allows for their flourishing in this kingdom, even though it is not the promised land. They're away from home. They are now able to, as a remnant people, continue to be the people of God, protected by God. But the Jewish people aren't powerful. As you go into this next week, I really do invite you to consider the position the Jewish people are in. Because it's not a good one going into this. They were in exile, enslaved and servants to the people of Babylon. The Babylonian kingdom falls. This new kingdom rises up in its place. But they're still the Jewish people. Most of them have left. They went back to Israel. And so there's fewer of them. And I don't know if you've ever studied history, you'll know that whenever a situation like this takes place, even after the end of a certain period of enslavement, it takes some time for peoples to regain powers. I mean, think about slavery in the U.S. Jim Crow America existed for a long time after that. The civil rights movements didn't take place until the 60s. There was still a lot of disenfranchisement that took place. These aren't powerful people, and yet they're going to survive. And so that's the note that I'll leave you on before we jump too far in to our next week. But these 4 chapters, I want you to think really hard about that reversal, about just how quickly God can turn a situation around. Because God can turn some situations around just the right conversations at just the right moments can make all the difference. And even though God never speaks from a cloud or a pillar of flame or shows his backside to somebody on a mountain, God has placed all the right people in the right places at the right times so that God's people can survive. Even when you find yourself in the darkest moments, God can put the right person in the right place at the right time, turn things around. I want you to consider that. I think that's good news. I do. I hope you do too. And so, because of time, that's where we're going to end. Thank you for joining us online. I know we have a couple of folks. I will see y'all next week.